The whine of the drill bit was a high, desperate sound that ended with a sharp crack of tortured metal. A string of curses, low and guttural, followed the sudden silence. In the grand dining hall, Lena paused, her hand hovering over a sterling silver fork, the polishing cloth limp in her fingers. That was the 25th one. 25 so-called experts, flown in from Geneva, Berlin, and Tokyo, all defeated by the hulking mass of steel and brass that squatted in the master's study. For a month, the entire Gangnam estate had been held hostage by the mood of one man and the stubbornness of one object. Kwon Jinwoo, the new head of an empire built on secrets and blood, was being mocked by a safe his father had left behind. And when the master was displeased, the displeasure seeped into the marble floors and crept up the silk-paneled walls, making the air thin and cold. Lena continued her work, her movements economical and precise. Her job was to be invisible, a ghost in a dark blue maid's dress and a crisp white apron. Her purpose was to erase any sign that life was lived within these opulent rooms, a fingerprint on a glass, a speck of dust on a lacquered table, the lingering scent of frustration and failure. She saw everything and showed nothing. She knew the names of the men who came and went, their faces grim, their suits hiding the cold weight of their purpose. She knew the cadence of Kwon's footsteps, the difference between the deliberate tread of a man in control and the restless pacing of a predator denied its prize. The dining hall door swung open. He stood there, framed by the dark wood, and the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Kwon Jinwoo did not need to raise his voice to command a room. His stillness did it for him. He was carved from something colder and harder than the men who served him. Tonight, his Tom Ford suit was the color of charcoal, sharp enough to cut. A Patek Philippe gleamed at his wrist, a subtle testament to the fact that time belonged to him. But his hands, resting at his sides, were clenched into fists, the only sign of the fury simmering beneath the placid, handsome surface of his face. He did not look at her. He never did. To him, she was part of the furniture, a functioning component of his well-ordered world. He moved to the mahogany sideboard, his reflection a fleeting ghost in the polished silver she had just finished. He poured a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light, the clink of the decanter against the crystal tumbler the only sound. "Get it out," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was speaking to the head of his security, a man named Choi, who stood like a statue by the door. "All of them. And clean that mess." The order was passed down the chain, and soon, Lena was kneeling on the Aubusson rug in the study, a dustpan and brush in her hand. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt metal. Tiny, glittering shavings littered the floor around the safe. It was magnificent and monstrous, a 2-ton behemoth of polished obsidian steel with intricate brass workings that snaked across its surface like golden veins. It looked less like a vault and more like a puzzle box designed by a mad god. She worked silently, sweeping the evidence of another man's failure. Her focus was on her task, but her eyes kept drifting to the safe. It was the mechanism that drew her. Not the polished dials or the imposing lock, but the almost invisible seam near the primary hinge. Through it, she could just glimpse the edge of an interlocking gear, a complex tooth system that was both beautiful and confounding. Her grandfather had been a clockmaker. Not the kind who simply replaced batteries, but a master craftsman who could resurrect 18th-century automatons from boxes of rust and wire. He had taught her to see the soul of a machine, to understand its language of springs and levers, balances and escapements. And looking at this safe, she felt a flicker of that old, familiar understanding. Without thinking, she murmured aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the vast, silent room. "It's not a lock. It's a chronometer escapement." The glass of whiskey stopped halfway to his lips. Kwon Jinwoo was still in the room, standing in the shadows by the vast window overlooking the glittering sprawl of Seoul. She hadn't even realized. Her blood went cold. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had made herself noticed. His head turned slowly, his dark eyes pinning her to the floor. It was the first time he had ever looked directly at her, and the weight of that gaze was a physical thing. It was unnerving, analytical, like being studied by a hawk just before it dives. "What did you say?" His voice was dangerously soft. "Nothing, sir." "My apologies," she bowed her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible again. He moved from the window, crossing the room in a few silent strides until he loomed over her. The scent of his cologne, a subtle, expensive mix of cedarwood and smoke, filled the air around her. "Say it again." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I said, it looks like a chronometer escapement. The gearing. It's not meant to be forced. It's a sequence. A rhythm. You don't fight it. You listen to it." A flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, or disbelief, crossed his features. 25 of the world's best engineers and safecrackers could not open it. "You are a maid." "Yes, sir," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. He was silent for a long time, the quiet stretching until it was a thin, screaming wire. She could feel his stare burning into the top of her head. He was a man who trusted only what he could control, what he could break. And this thing, this inheritance of steel and secrets, refused to yield. He was desperate. "Get up," he commanded. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady. He gestured to the safe with a sharp, impatient flick of his wrist. "Show me." Panic seized her. This was a test she could not possibly pass. Failure would mean his scorn, perhaps her job. But success? Success felt infinitely more dangerous. Yet to refuse was not an option. She approached the safe, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, forcing the image of her grandfather's workshop into her mind, the smell of oil and old wood, the gentle, rhythmic ticking that was the heartbeat of her youth. She placed her palms flat against the cold steel door, closing her eyes, trying to feel the machine beneath the surface. Then, she placed her fingers on the primary dial. She didn't spin it. She applied the slightest pressure, turning it until she felt an infinitesimal catch, a change in tension almost too small to register. It was what her grandfather had called finding the pulse. She moved to a second, smaller dial, repeating the process, then a third. It wasn't about a combination of numbers. It was a combination of pressures, of aligning gears that were weighted and balanced with the precision of a Swiss watch. Her hands moved with a deftness and certainty that surprised even herself, a muscle memory from a life she had left far behind. Quan watched her, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw the transformation, the way the timid maid disappeared, replaced by someone with an unnerving focus and confidence. Her dark blue uniform seemed at odds with the surgical precision of her touch. She was listening not with her ears, but with her fingertips, feeling the faint vibrations as the tumblers settled. 1, 2, a third, a cascade of internal mechanisms shifting into alignment. She found the final dial, hidden within the brass filigree, and gave it a precise quarter-turn counterclockwise. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from deep within the safe, came a low, resonant thud. It was the sound of surrender, a heavy, satisfying sound as a dozen bolts retracted in unison. The immense steel door swung inward by a single, silent inch. It was open. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands falling to her sides. She stepped back, her duty done, ready to melt back into the shadows. But Quan Jinwoo moved, faster than she could have anticipated. He didn't go to the safe. He stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path to the door. He stared down at her, his face a mask of profound shock, suspicion, and something else she couldn't name. It was a look of discovery, as if he had been living in a house full of furniture and had just realized one of the chairs was, in fact, a sleeping tiger. The air crackled with a new and terrifying energy. The problem of the safe was solved, but a much more complex one had just been created. "You will not be leaving," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an iron gate slamming shut. He wasn't talking about the study. He was talking about his world. And Lena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had just become his most valuable and most dangerous possession. Lena's life as a maid was over. The dark blue dress and white apron were replaced by silk blouses and tailored slacks she hadn't chosen, delivered to the luxurious guest suite that was now her gilded cage. She was no longer Lena, the cleaner. She was Kwan's consultant, a title that meant nothing and everything. She ate meals prepared by the chef, served on porcelain she used to polish, but she ate them alone. The silence was a constant companion. Her freedom had been the price of her competence. Kwan kept her close, not out of any kindness, but out of a cold, proprietary logic. A key that could open the impossible was a key you never let out of your sight. She spent her days in the study, now his command center, watching as he governed his shadow empire. Men with faces like stone and loyalty forged in violence came and went, bowing to him, their reports delivered in low, urgent tones. She learned the language of his business not through words, but through the tension in the room, the sharp intake of a subordinate's breath, the chilling stillness that preceded one of Kwan's quiet, lethal orders. The contents of the safe were not what anyone expected. There were no gold bars, no bearer bonds, no deeds to offshore properties. There was only a thick, leather-bound ledger and a small, rosewood music box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. One evening, after dismissing his last lieutenant, Kwan finally turned his attention to it. He opened the ledger, his jaw tightening as he scanned the elegant script. Lena watched from her chair in the corner, a silent observer in a life that was no longer her own. After several minutes, he closed the book with a snap. He picked up the music box, his long fingers tracing the delicate inlay. With a soft click, he opened it. A tinkling, melancholic melody filled the silent room. It was a sad, beautiful tune that seemed to hold a world of regret. Kwan's composure, usually so absolute, fractured for a moment. A flicker of raw pain crossed his face before being suppressed. "It belonged to Sohee," he said, his voice rough. He didn't look at Lena, but he was speaking to her. It was the most he had shared with her in weeks. "She was my father's advisor. After my mother died, she was a fixture in this house. She understood the intricacies of the business better than he did. She was brilliant." He fell silent, the music box playing its lonely tune. "My father had enemies, the Park family, chief among them. They knew he relied on Sohee's counsel. They saw her as his foundation. So they took her from him, to watch him crumble." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which only amplified the horror of the words. "It worked. My father was never the same. He became paranoid, cruel. He built this safe afterward, a fortress for his secrets." He finally turned his gaze on Lena, and his eyes were dark with a memory that had never faded. "I was supposed to be her escort that night. A car was waiting to take her to a meeting across the city. I was delayed. A trivial matter, a shipment dispute that could have waited. By the time I arrived at her apartment, it was too late. The shame he carried was a palpable thing, a wound that had never healed. The invincible Kwon Jinwoo had a vulnerability after all, and it was tied to the ghost of a woman he had failed to protect. Lena saw it then. His obsession with the safe wasn't about his father's legacy. It was about penance. Opening it was his attempt to finally confront the failure that had haunted him for years. Word that Kwan's safe had been spread through the Seoul underworld like wildfire. The Park family, now led by the aging but still cunning Park Min-jun, grew agitated. They believed the ledger contained proof of their deepest treasons, information that could give Kwan the justification he needed to eradicate them completely. The first message came a week later. A massive explosion rocked the estate, shattering windows on the ground floor. A car bomb detonated just outside the main gate. It was a warning shot, a crude but clear declaration of war. In the ensuing chaos, sirens screamed in the distance, and Kwan's men swarmed the perimeter. For a few frantic minutes, discipline frayed. A secondary gate, used for service vehicles, was left unsecured as guards scrambled to the primary breach. Lena saw it. From the study window, she saw the sliver of darkness that meant freedom. No one was watching her. She had her passport and a small nest egg of cash hidden away, enough to disappear and start over. A normal life, one without the constant, suffocating fear and the magnetic pull of the dangerous man who held her captive. She could just walk away. She took a step toward the door, then another. Her heart pounded with the possibility. But she paused, her gaze drawn back to the scene outside. Amidst the flashing lights and shouting men, Kwon stood in the center of the chaos.
He wasn't shouting.
He was a pillar of calm, issuing orders with quiet, deadly precision, his hand gestures directing his soldiers like a conductor leading a symphony of violence. He was magnificent in his element. She thought of the music box, of the story of So-hee, of the guilt that drove the unshakable man. And she realized, with a sinking feeling, that she didn't want to run. She was entangled in the story, and she wanted to see how it ended. With a deep breath, she turned away from the window and the open gate. She deliberately walked back to the center of the room, sat in her chair, and waited. She had made a choice. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a participant. Later that night, long after the wreckage had been cleared and a tense order restored, he found her in the library. She was running her fingers over the spine of a book, but she wasn't reading. He stood in the doorway, just watching her. He knew. He had to know she'd had a chance to escape. He walked toward her, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. The space between them was charged, heavy with unspoken questions. "The men my father hired," he said, his voice low. "The strategists, the lawyers, they were all brilliant. But they were predictable. Their minds worked along established lines." He looked down at her, his gaze intense. "You are more intelligent than any of them. You see the world differently. You see the hidden mechanisms." He paused. "That makes you more dangerous." He reached out, his motion slow, deliberate. His fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed a stray curl back from her temple. The touch was featherlight, a spark against her skin that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was brief, almost deniable, but it was the first crack in his armor, the first hint of something other than cold calculation. And it was more intoxicating than any declaration could ever be. Kwon used the ledger like a scalpel. The information within allowed him to surgically dismantle the Park family's alliances and revenue streams. He didn't launch a frontal assault. He bled them slowly, methodically, with a predator's patience. Lena was a permanent fixture in the study during his strategy sessions. She sat in her corner, silent, as he and Choi mapped out their next moves. He never asked for her opinion, but she felt his eyes on her often, gauging her reactions, as if her perspective was a new, valuable metric he was learning to read. He gave her a task to keep her occupied, a project to keep her close, organize his father's personal files, decades of correspondence and records stored in the study's massive mahogany desk. It was tedious work, but it was a window into the man who had built this empire. One afternoon, her fingers found a false bottom in a deep drawer. Inside was a slim, personal journal, bound not in leather, but in simple linen. It wasn't his father's handwriting. The script was feminine, elegant. It was So-hee's. Curiosity warred with a sense of trespassing. She opened it. The entries chronicled So-hee's last year. At first, they were filled with admiration for Kwon's father, for his vision and strength. But the tone shifted, turning to frustration, then fear. He was becoming possessive, his trust curdling into paranoia. The final entries were terrifying. So-hee had discovered the true depth of his cruelty. She had made contact with the Park family, not to betray him, but to orchestrate an escape. She was planning to disappear, to leave the monster she had helped create. The last entry was dated the day before her death. "He knows. He looked at me today, and the warmth was gone. I saw the final calculation in his eyes. He will not let me leave. He would rather see me dead." Lena felt a wave of nausea. The story Kwon carried, the guilt that was the one humanizing crack in his armor, was a lie. A carefully constructed fiction his father had created to bind his son to him with the chains of failure and vengeance. So he hadn't been a martyr. She had been a prisoner trying to escape, and her jailer had killed her for it. The safe wasn't to protect secrets from his enemies. It was to protect this one ugly truth from his son. Lena stared at the journal in her hands. She held the power to detonate the foundations of Kwan's world, to shatter the only piece of his past that fueled him with something other than cold ambition. What would he become without that guilt? A monster like his father? Or would the truth set him free? She couldn't risk it. In that moment, she made a choice that bound her to him more deeply than any door he could lock. She took the journal to the fireplace. With trembling hands, she lit a match and watched as the pages and the truth turned to black, curling ash. She was no longer an observer. She had just become a conspirator, an architect of the lie that held him together. She had crossed a line, and she could never go back. The Parks, cornered and bleeding, grew desperate. They launched a final, audacious assault on the estate itself. It wasn't a warning shot. It was an invasion. The night exploded with the sound of automatic gunfire. Alarms blared. Lena was trapped in the study as the battle raged through the house and grounds. Through the bulletproof windows, she saw flashes of muzzle fire. Kwan was out there, in the thick of it, a ghost moving through the chaos. Then she saw it. One of Park's assassins, moving with terrifying speed, broke through the defensive line. He had a clear shot at Kwan, whose back was turned as he dealt with another threat. There was no time to scream. Instinct took over. Lena's eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy, bronze statue of a dragon on the desk. It was solid, weighty. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed it, ran to the side of the room, and hurled it with all her might not at the assassin, but at the towering glass-fronted bookshelf behind him. The crash was cataclysmic. A shower of glass and books rained down. The sudden, explosive noise behind him caused the assassin to flinch, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Kwan needed. He spun, his movements a fluid, lethal blur. 2 silence shots, precise and final. The threat was gone. Across the blood-soaked lawn, through the smoke and chaos, Kwan's eyes found hers through the study window. The look that passed between them was more profound than any touch. He knew. She had just saved his life. The adrenaline of the fight eventually faded, leaving behind an exhausted, ringing silence. The estate was secure, the invaders dead or captured. Kwan came to her suite late that night. He didn't knock. He simply entered, closing the door softly behind him. He looked at her, his usual mask of control stripped away, leaving something raw and exposed. "My father built walls," he said, his voice quiet in the dim room. He surrounded himself with locks and secrets. "I spent years believing that safe was his final judgment on me, a test I couldn't pass." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You are the first thing in this house that has ever felt open." He searched for the right word, his brow furrowed. "And I find I have no defenses against it." It wasn't a confession of love. It was an admission of a fatal flaw, a vulnerability he couldn't afford and yet couldn't erase. It was the most dangerous, honest thing he had ever said. But their moment of connection had been witnessed. Old Man Park, captured but not broken, had seen the look that passed between Kwan and his maid during the firefight. He had found Kwan's weakness. It wasn't his money or his territory. It was the woman who could open impossible locks and who saw the world in a way no one else did. 2 days later, Lena went for a walk in the gardens, a privilege she had recently been granted. The guards were discreet, but ever-present. It didn't matter. The attack came from within. The new gardener, a man she had seen a dozen times, grabbed her, a cloth pressed over her face. The world dissolved into blackness. Park Min-joon had made his final move. He wasn't targeting the empire. He was targeting its queen. Lena woke to the damp chill of a concrete floor. She was in a warehouse, the air thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. Park Min-joon sat on a crate opposite her, looking ancient and frail, but his eyes burned with a fanatic's fire. He wanted to trade her for the ledger and Kwan's public surrender. But Lena was not the same woman who had polished silver just months ago. She had watched a master strategist at work. She had learned to observe, to find the cracks in a system. She listened to her guards, two brutish men whose loyalty to their failing boss was clearly wavering. She noticed one of them, the younger one, couldn't keep his thumb still, a constant, nervous flicking motion. She remembered reading a file on one of Park's lieutenants who had been ruined by a gambling addiction. The file had mentioned his son, who had the same tell. She waited until the old man was gone. "Your father is losing," she said to the younger guard, her voice calm and steady. "When he falls, Kwon will crush everyone who stood with him. Your family's debt will be the least of your problems." The man's eyes widened. How do you know about that?" "Kwon knows everything," she said, letting the lie settle in the cold air. "But he is a man of logic. He rewards loyalty. He pays debts. Help me, and your family will be free of what they owe. Your slate will be clean." She was planting a seed of betrayal, using Kwon's fearsome reputation as her weapon. The assault, when it came, was swift and brutal. Kwon's men stormed the warehouse, and the world erupted into controlled chaos. In the final confrontation, Park, defeated and cornered, grabbed Lena, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a knife pressed to her throat. "You see, Jin-woo," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She is your weakness. Just like so he was your father's." But Lena wasn't listening to his rant. Her eyes were locked on a heavy industrial lamp beside them, its base secured to the floor with thick bolts. While Park had been monologuing, she'd been working her fingers against the corroded metal, finding one of the bolts loose, wiggling it free. Kwon created a diversion, a feint to his left. It was all she needed. As Park's attention shifted, Lena braced herself and slammed her full weight backward. The loose lamp tilted, and she kicked out, her heel connecting with the old man's knee. There was a sickening crack. He screamed, his grip on her faltering for a single, crucial second. It was the opening. Kwon moved, a blur of black, and the confrontation was over. She hadn't waited to be saved. She had made her own rescue. In the ringing silence that followed, amidst the carnage, Kwon came to her. He ignored everyone else. His hands gently framed her face, his thumbs brushing away the grime from her cheeks as he checked her for injuries. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his eyes, only a raw, undeniable truth. "They targeted you because they thought you were my weakness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He shook his head slowly. "They were wrong," he paused, the admission seeming to cost him a piece of his hardened soul. "You are my strength." The war was over, but victory had a price. Kwon had consolidated his power, purging his organization with a ruthlessness that even his father would have admired. He was more powerful, more feared, and more isolated than ever. And Lena could never go back to her old life. The woman who dreamed of restoring antique clocks was gone, burned away with Sohee's journal in the fireplace. She had lied, manipulated, and become an accessory to this dark, violent world. That was the cost of her survival, of her choice. Weeks later, the estate was pristine once more, the scars of the battle erased. Lena stood beside Kwon in the study, looking out the panoramic window at the sea of lights that was Seoul. She wore a simple black dress of her own choosing. He had never asked her to stay. He didn't have to. Her presence was a fact, an anchor in his tumultuous world. He turned from the window. In his hand was the small, rosewood music box. He didn't open it. He simply extended his hand and placed it in hers. The wood was smooth and cool against her palm. It was the past, the lie, the wound that had defined him, and he was giving it to her to keep. Her fingers closed around it, a silent acceptance. It was not a promise of love, not a guarantee of peace. It was a choice, made with eyes wide open, to reign beside him in a kingdom of shadows. The music was silent, but in the weight of the box, she could feel the start of a new, dangerous melody.